Why talk about games? It's a question many of us might think about from time to time. It throws our beliefs about what games really are into question. Nobody doubts that television and film are worthy of discussion and analysis, but the same is rarely heard for games. Perhaps it's the personal nature of games, and especially in recent years, it's unlikely that any two players will have the exact same experience with the same game. Without equal exposure to a game's content, it doesn't seem fair to say that all discussions are equally valid, or that all opinions are equally justified. But the game industry is changing so fast and continues to increase its dominance in homes all over the world, so doesn't it merit at least consideration? The main argument one might hear about video games is, well, they're nothing more than an escapist entertainment form. And while this is certainly correct, at least for most of today's titles, the argument usually implies that anything entertaining or escapist is a waste of time and resources. Especially with teenagers still attending school until their senior year, video games are usually seen as a detriment to a student's success, and their popularity caused companies like Nintendo to release hugely anticipated hits on Fridays or the weekend to avoid cries of truancy because of their game. That's a personal battle that these companies don't want or need to be a part of. They're just doing what they can to stay in business, like any company would. So if these video games are nothing more than a time waster for idle boredom, then why are they such a valuable cultural resource? The truth is that any form of media, television, film, music, books, or gaming, could be considered a waste of time, or hugely important, as long as the content you're accessing was purposely designed to be so. When you decide you want to watch a film, you have your pick of tens of thousands of films ranging from action to comedy to educational documentary. When you pick up a book, you might read a spy thriller or a biography of one of science's pioneering researchers. To oversimplify this argument even further, you might turn on your television to either watch World War II documentaries or the latest episode of Honey Boo Boo. Every medium is little more than a platform for artists to share their visions. The word medium in this case literally refers to the middleman between producer and consumer. A television by itself isn't inherently uneducational, nor are video games inherently wasteful. It's the artists and the producers that determine what go through these channels that really shape the way that medium is received by society. A fun fact here, in 2012, romance and erotica books generated almost $1.5 billion in revenue. That was more than twice the amount generated by the next largest genre, which was crime and mystery. And yet, you'd be hard-pressed to find the person who believes that books as media are dangerous wastes of time and should not be permitted to be read by children. For one thing, since books are the oldest art form out of the 5 we've listed here, they've sort of been grandfathered in over time, meaning that their existence actually predates the cultural explosions that shaped what's currently popular on other forms of media, like action thrillers and film, or gritty World War II shooters and gaming. Books are largely immune to such criticisms because not only are they an intensely personal experience, but there are just so many of them. There were almost 300,000 books published last year alone, and with the advent of self-publishing and e-readers, this number is only going to grow with time. There are just too many titles that cover literally every topic on the planet, and since books have been culturally accepted for hundreds and hundreds of years, you'd seem like a real weirdo if you went on a holy crusade to ban and burn every book in existence. The best argument, and perhaps the most justified, is that books teach a fundamental skill for social function. They teach us how to read, and they expand our vocabulary. There is no limit to how much one should read, and children are encouraged to turn off the television so that their skills in written communication can be tempered. While this logic has held for centuries, it's actually becoming a little bit less important. The digital age removes the requirement that ordinary citizens know how to spell ordinary words. Any word processor or email host will autocorrect and highlight misspelled words. A simple Google search will give you access to 1,000 or more thesauri or dictionaries or rhyming words. While it is still crucial for children to be exposed to challenging reading, their future success is now very much less dependent on their ability to master the art of reading and writing. When was the last time you wrote an essay by hand? When was the last time you sent a postcard in the mail to a friend? When was the last time you needed to use a physical dictionary to look up a word? So books are important because they can teach us to read and write and to broaden our vocabulary. Like any art form, they also give us perspective, and they allow us to experience things that we would never have the opportunity to do normally. Since this isn't strictly a feature of books, we won't really count it here as a critical factor. Film and television can do the same thing, and even more vividly, since we no longer have to just imagine these things. We can now see and hear them as if they were actually happening to us. And this brings us to something that you may not think of when you play a video game. If a book is important because it teaches linguistic fluency, then what does a video game provide? No doubt it, like TV and film, allows one to broaden their worldview, perhaps by sitting in the trenches of an ongoing war, or living the life of a stay-at-home dad, and anything in between these two extremes. Games provide us with a unique experience in a world that doesn't exist, at least within the lifetime of the player. When society looks in a mirror, just like with film, books, and music, video games are the reflection that it sees. Every game ever published was done so by a group of people living on the same planet, possibly in the same country as you, seeing all the same world events and social changes. The games they produce rarely match up one-to-one with our idea of planet Earth's social norms. This means that gaming is a wholly creative process, adopting social conventions in new and unique ways to provide a brand new experience. And at the same time, The fact that all games must still be rooted in convention means that we can easily make a mental comparison between a game's world and our own, and try to draw out important similarities and differences. We're getting a little esoteric here, so let's take a concrete example. Majora's Mask for the N64 is a great one, because just as the player is choosing to enter a new world by playing the game, so is Link forced into an alternate world Termina at the start of his adventure. Things are as unfamiliar to Link as they are to us, and we share the same emotions when we come across a new stimulus inside the game world. We both may feel a surge of panic when we encounter a boss 10 times our own size, or we might yawn and shift idly if left to sit alone in a room. But remember how we said that all games must still be rooted in convention? This factor is in fact so influential that it's almost difficult to see that it's everywhere in the game world. Clocktown is made of narrow streets and alleys. It has buildings made of stone, and they hold shops with shopkeepers behind desks, and we can exchange currency to buy products from them. There's a bar that doesn't permit minors, and the guards at the edges of the town carry typical helmets and spears. These are the characteristics that are so fundamental to understanding a game's world that they can't be reasonably changed. What if Clocktown didn't have discrete architecture or stores? What if the grass was purple and the residents used telepathy instead of speech? What if instead of having to use a sword to attack enemies, the physics of the world dictated that you had to scream at them as loud as you can? Why do Termina citizens still look and act human if they're clearly not on our planet? The answer is because changing any of these ground-level conventions of human interaction would ruin the mental comparisons that we can make. They give us something to grasp onto as we enter an unfamiliar world, and while many things are different in Termina, as long as the basics of human interaction and the physics of movement remain much the same, we can pretty much understand and appreciate any artistic choice. Game developers typically choose to implement unfamiliarity in a singular gameplay element. Some games might involve slowing down time, controlling fire through a magic system, losing precious experience when dying, or molding a character's personality through a dialogue wheel. Most games work to only implement one of these dramatic changes to core mechanics, because to throw them all into the game would be to completely confuse and alienate the player. The player still needs to have a grounding in reality, but a few major changes from what we expect can be done if they remain logical for a game's world. You'll likely never see a game that implements all of these mechanics at any one time, because the result would be a disaster of ideas glued together. In the GameCube title Beautiful Joe, Joe has the ability to speed up or slow down time, which is consistent with the game's film-like grain and film reel bordered cutscenes. The rest of the gameplay is solid, but because of this addition of the time mechanics, every level can incorporate these ideas and present something unique to the player. Until recently, games weren't really known for their deep interwoven storytelling, but we've begun to see a narrative change in newer titles. Mass Effect 3 had 40,000 lines of dialogue, while Fallout New Vegas contained 65,000. Star Wars The Old Republic shattered the world record with its 200,000 spoken lines of dialogue. Story-driven games like these are slowly blurring the line between film and video game, and because video games aren't limited to a 2-hour runtime, these conversations might be explored over the course of 50 hours or more. As far as world building and character development go, a game has many more tools at its disposal than a film does. Setting a tone and atmosphere are often considered vital to a game's storytelling, so much more care is taken in titles like Skyrim to provide the player with backstory, especially because the world is so huge. Skyrim couldn't easily be transformed into a 2-hour movie without losing most of its landscape and quests, and the end result would hardly remind us of the game at all. Films typically only have about 2 hours to sell us on their story, so many choose to forego deeply interwoven, unapproachable stories. Toy Story is one of the greatest films of all time, but you notice that it doesn't try to suggest depth with symbolism, metaphor, or any other ham-fisted narrative device. It speaks to our human emotions, rather than to the knowledge-hungry academic in us. Games do the very same thing. If they're not focused on being as deep and artistic as possible, then their mechanics are free to affect us in the most basic and relatable ways, all while showing us a world that may not even exist. Now consider the tone of Majora's Mask. Termina is a tragic world with heavy backstory. It incites a primal fear when we look up at the moon looming overhead, or the clock ticking away at the bottom of the screen. It reminds us, even in adversity, that everyone still has dreams and goals. The postman doesn't stop delivering mail even though the world's going to end in 3 days. He takes his work seriously, as if he realizes that he's the only NPC in Termina that can deliver mail. He only leaves after being ordered to do so by another character. When you see him running around in Clocktown, you get the feeling that he's dedicated, rather than programmed, to act in a certain way. Our base human emotions make up his story for us, instead of seeing a clump of polygons moving around on a screen. His determination is thus easily translatable, and we may even find inspiration from it. In fact, all of Clocktown plays out in a way that would be eerily reminiscent if we all lived in a world where the moon was about to crash down on us. We can play this game without any real-life danger to us, but still get the chance to see how the people around us might react to such an event. In the process, we'd see highlighted the strengths and weaknesses of our emotions, displays of character and duty, and the moments of happiness that can only be spurned by an impending demise. So even though the moon isn't about to crash into planet Earth, we can compare Termina to our own planet and better understand the perspective of our fellow human beings. This is what I mean when I say that video games are a reflection of society. They are a sum of all the basal behaviors that we've developed as a species, but portrayed in a way that shows us how we actually behave in the civilized world. If you were a caveman, you wouldn't care about delivering the mail to a nearby town. You'd be focused on finding food and shelter, and simply surviving. The concept of a mailman is one brought on by culture, rather than nature. And because culture is self-fulfilling, the reflection we see is not only a result of the world we live in, but also shapes our world as a result. This is most frequently seen throughout history via books and essays. For example, a book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair was partially responsible for the creation of the FDA, because it exposed the terrible working conditions in the meatpacking industry. A reader of any book might compare the world around him to the world in the book, and come up with an idea to improve his own quality of life. The products of our culture can literally loop back around and change the very culture they're based on, as long as they allow us to draw conclusions about their true messages. No media form has ever come close to emulating the interactivity, topical range, and global connectivity of video games. Consequently, no media form has close to the same potential as gaming to affect our world in this self-fulfilling loop of culture. Final Fantasy VI reminds us to be grateful that we don't live in a world of ruin, with a maniacal clown vying for world domination. Mega Man X shows us that even the most unlikely hero can grow his power over time, make smart decisions, and ultimately find success in his goals. World of Warcraft shows us that the power of an individual is sometimes strong enough to cause major change in global events. And we are reminded in turn that all of us have the power to change our world for better or worse, as long as we're determined enough. Finally, the world of Dark Souls is so bleak and depressing that just playing it might make you feel happy to be alive and well. All of these conclusions could be drawn from other forms of media, but none are as easily accessible or cohesive as video games. A book can't have a failure state, just as a film can't be experienced at your own pace. Music lacks the important visual cues that will enhance your comprehension, and TV is a strictly passive activity. We've never before had such a direct influence and control over a narrative that ultimately teaches us about ourselves, because it is created by us. The point of any form of media is to engage the consumer in some way. We want film to make us feel certain emotions, just as we want art to make us think about certain ideas. In this regard, all else being equal, television is an objectively superior form of radio, because it carries a visual component while losing none of the audio capabilities. The more ways that a medium can be digested by the people using it, the easier it is to lose yourself and gain understanding of its goals at the same time. We have 5 major senses and countless others that we use to experience the world, and the more senses that something can elicit responses from, the more engaging that it will ultimately be. While a book can use description to explore the 5 senses in a scene, a video game can transmit these senses directly to the player, without syntactical proxy. So if television is superior radio because it gives you visuals, then what would be the next logical step after television? You'd want to engage another sense, perhaps touch, so you could work with 3 of the 5 major senses when you experience something new. Lo and behold, video games appear to be the result. They rely on audio and visual information, but with the key difference of allowing you to directly control them. Video games have never been a passive activity because the addition of the sense of touch is monumental in shaping the way that something can be experienced. If you can feel a game controller, then you can add buttons and joysticks, and each one has a specific effect on the game. The game reacts to you, and the experience is all the more personal because of it. The only time video games are ever passive is when they're TV again. In a cutscene, you put the controller down and you watch characters talk for a few minutes. You'll see cinematography and lighting very similar to film and television, and you'll watch a dialogue that takes place that explains the game's story. So video games can be TV if they want to, swapping between active and passive at will. So if television is superior radio, does that mean that video games are superior television? After all, there's nothing that a television could do that a video game theoretically couldn't, except maybe scroll through 100 cable channels one after the other. But the idea that what a television shows you with audio and video can not only be reproduced exactly but also enhanced by the sensation of touch means that the TV is no longer needed to do TV-like activities. But it goes even farther than that. Could you ever use a TV to read a book? You know, flip to the 50 Shades of Grey station and a guy holding a camera just slowly pans down each page and, flips them after a few seconds. Without even getting into all the pacing problems this would create, let's just say that television can't replace the written word, because reading is marginally active. But a game console can provide audio, video, and interaction at your own pace. If you want to pick up a book in Dragon Age and spend the next 20 minutes reading through and turning pages just like in real life, you can. If you want to drive around in a car in Grand Theft Auto and listen to a radio station, you can. If you want to watch Solid Snake engage in 10 minutes of witty banter with one of his teammates, you can. Books, film, television, and radio are all separate ideas, each with their own limitations. But the video game is capable of integrating every single one of these ideas into a larger narrative. Gaming is a box that carries all previous forms of media inside of it, and it can pick and choose at will where and when to use each form as a means to tell its own story. It has all the advantages of every single media form without any loss of function. Now we all know that games don't look as good as real life, but keep in mind that video games are still in a very young state of mind, and we've only just begun to see what they're capable of. For now, there still exists a need for television and film because games can't entirely replace them yet. So I would ask you to consider whether video games as media are objectively superior to other forms because they provide every sensory outlet in a single cohesive package. Give us your thoughts about this idea in the comments section, and we may just discuss them in a future video. Just as books can improve your literacy with words and speech, various studies have hinted that video games improve our thinking and reflex skills. Purely anecdotally, puzzle games are always encouraging the player to take one more mental leap from where they stand, often leading to a new perspective on a complex puzzle. This kind of gameplay augments lateral thinking in games, and it's not difficult to imagine how it might be transferred to other challenges in a gamer's life. Furthermore, a study by the University of Toronto concluded that action games allow us to learn unrelated tasks more quickly, but only if those tasks rely on hand-eye coordination. If you spend 30 hours a week involved in a deeply complex task demanding full attention from both your hands and eyes, it seems reasonable to extrapolate this skill into other aspects of your life. If gaming and another activity share the same kind of inputs, but differ in the exact sensory motor sequences, then any skill that improves one of them should have an effect on the other. An analogy might be learning to ride a bike, and then using what you learned from bike riding to practice riding a unicycle. Someone who's a good juggler might be a fast learner when flipping pizzas, because both activities involve the same parts of the body and brain. A few of the possible benefits from video games are improved reflex time, better perception and object discrimination, and more open thinking when facing a challenge. Very little of this data is actually conclusive, but it all tends to point in the same direction, so it seems very likely that it is scientifically valid. The best thing we can do now to further elucidate these connections is to continue making games that push the boundaries of a player's mind and body, and to test whether improvements in cognitive function are not only transferable to other activities, but are also permanent. So we realize that games have as much, if not more potential than any other form of media to engage and elicit responses from a consumer. They're most typically an escapist activity, it's true, but that really depends on what kinds of games are being made and what kinds of games are in demand. Video games as a medium are merely a platform for the artist to stand up tall and share with us whatever it is he or she wants us to see, hear, or touch. Video games can be as social as watching a film with 10 friends, or as personal as sitting silently in your room reading a book you can't put down. They give us unprecedented perspective that few other art forms are capable of doing. And I believe that it's our obligation to receive these messages loud and clear, with the same sincerity that we use to experience film, television, books, and music. So discussion of gaming is crucial to the ongoing progression of our society, because only by looking in the mirror can we truly see our own nature reflected directly back at us. Thank you for watching.